Picture this for a moment. You're standing on an endless stretch of prairie. There are no buildings, no roads, nothing but grassland rolling toward the horizon. The air is quiet, almost too quiet. Then, a deep rumble begins to rise from the earth. At first, it feels like thunder in the distance, but it isn't the sky. It's the ground beneath your feet. And then you see them, wave after wave of massive, shaggy giants pouring over the hills, their hooves striking the earth like a heartbeat you can feel in your chest. This was North America thousands of years ago when the ancient bison ruled the land. The bison were more than animals. They were the living pulse of the continent. They shaped the land, carved the grasslands, and carried entire ecosystems on their backs. For early people, they meant food, shelter, tools, even spiritual meaning. For predators, they were both a challenge and a lifeline. And for the land itself, they were its caretakers, keeping the Great Plains alive. This is not just a story about a species. It's a story about survival, about connection, and about how one creature could define an entire continent. The ancient bison weren't simply part of America's past. They were America's past, and their thunder still echoes, even today. 12,000 years ago, when the Ice Age still held the world in its frozen grip, the Great Plains of North America stretched endlessly beneath the sky, both beautiful and unforgiving. Across this vast sea of grass moved one of the most remarkable creatures to ever walk the earth, the ancient bison. Larger than the modern bison we know today, their bodies were built for survival in a world where winter could last for years and summers brought only brief relief. With long, shaggy coats that shielded them from the bitter winds, and with massive horns curving outward like the weapons of warriors, they were both majestic and formidable. These bison were not simply animals wandering the plains. They were symbols of endurance, a heartbeat of the Ice Age itself. Their herds stretched farther than the eye could see, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands. And when they moved together, the ground trembled under their weight as if the earth itself recognized their power. To the predators of this frozen land, the saber-toothed cat, the dire wolf, and the short-faced bear, the bison were both a prize and a challenge. Taking down one of these giants required strategy, strength, and often the cooperation of a pack. Yet for the bison, survival was not only about facing predators, it was about enduring the brutal shifts of climate, the storms of snow and ice that could blanket the land for months, and the sudden droughts that could wither the grass that fed them. Their story is not just the story of an animal. It is the saga of adaptation, of resilience, and of the eternal struggle between life and death that defined the Ice Age world. The ancient bison were not simply grazing beasts. They were architects of the ecosystem, shaping the land with their migrations, carving pathways through the snow, and turning barren fields into fertile grounds through their constant movement. Where they walked, life followed. Their presence meant food for wolves, cats, bears, and even early humans who stalked them with stone-tipped spears. The survival of many species depended on the strength and numbers of the bison herds. As we begin this journey into their story, we step onto the endless frozen plains, where the winds carry the echoes of their thundering hooves and the shadows of their massive forms stretch across the horizon. This is the world of the ancient bison, a world where every sunrise brought both promise and danger, and where the survival of the herd meant the survival of an entire Ice Age ecosystem. The ancient bison were more than just inhabitants of the Ice Age plains. They were the very heartbeat of those frozen landscapes, shaping the environment with every step they took. Imagine standing on the crest of a ridge 12,000 years ago and gazing down at a valley where a sea of dark, shaggy bodies stretched beyond the horizon. Tens of thousands of bison moved as one, their breath rising in great clouds that mingled with the morning frost, their hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that echoed like distant thunder. They were giants compared to the bison we know today, with some individuals standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. Their massive curved horns could span more than 3 feet from tip to tip, weapons as much as tools, for they used them not only to fight predators and rivals, but also to shovel through snow in search of the grasses buried beneath. These herds were not mindless wanderers. They were master strategists of survival, following seasonal routes carved into memory over generations, routes that took them to rivers that never fully froze, to valleys where the snow melted sooner, and to higher grounds where the winds kept the grass exposed even in the harshest winters. The land itself bore the scars and pathways of their migrations. Trails beaten into the ground by centuries of hooves became the roads of future animals and even of humans who would one day follow in their footsteps. In summer, when the plains burst into brief life, the bison grazed endlessly, their broad muzzles sweeping through the grasses, consuming in a day what smaller animals could eat in a week. And yet, even in their abundance, the plains never emptied, for the bison were part of a delicate cycle, fertilizing the soil, spreading seeds in their fur, and ensuring that life could flourish again the next season. But life in the Ice Age was never without peril. At the edge of the herd, a young bison calf might stray too far, and from the shadow of the trees a pack of dire wolves could emerge, their amber eyes locked on the weakest link. Or a saber-toothed cat, silent and patient, could leap from the cover of tall grass, its fangs driving deep into the throat of an unsuspecting adult. And yet, the bison were not helpless. When threatened, the herd would form a circle, the strongest bulls standing shoulder to shoulder, horns lowered, surrounding the calves and females within. Predators often thought twice before charging into that wall of muscle and bone. In those moments, the bison proved that their strength was not only in size but in unity. They were not solitary survivors. They were a civilization on hooves, a living fortress that moved as one across the frozen earth. For the ancient bison, life was a ceaseless dance with the seasons, a rhythm dictated by the sun, the snow, and the winds that swept endlessly across the Ice Age plains. When spring arrived, it was like a rebirth of the land. The snow began to retreat, leaving behind wet meadows where tender shoots of grass pushed through the thawing soil. It was in these brief weeks of renewal that new life joined the herds. Calves were born with soft reddish-brown coats, their spindly legs unsteady at first but quickly gaining strength. Within days, they could run alongside their mothers, blending into the flow of the herd like drops of water in a rushing river. Their survival depended not just on their speed, but on the shield of thousands of adults around them. The air was alive with the sounds of snorts, bellows, and the constant shuffle of hooves as the herd moved to richer pastures. Summer, though brief, was a season of abundance. Grasses grew waist-high in some valleys, and the herds grazed tirelessly, their broad muzzles sweeping across the plains like living harvesters. The bulls began to prepare for the rutting season, when the stillness of summer nights was broken by their deep, thunderous bellows. These vocal displays echoed across miles of open land, announcing dominance and strength to rivals. When two bulls clashed, the ground itself seemed to shake. They lowered their massive heads, horns clashing with a sound like splintering wood, pushing with all their might in contests that could last for hours. Blood was often spilled, but rarely death, for the battles were about proving strength and securing the right to mate, not about annihilation. The victors claimed their place among the cows, passing on the legacy of their endurance and power. Autumn brought change. The days grew shorter, the winds colder, and the grass, once green and lush, turned brittle and dry. The herds grew restless, instinct driving them southward, following routes as old as their species. Migrating herds stretched for miles, so vast that if you stood in one place, it might take hours for the flow of animals to pass. Alongside them moved flocks of birds, riding the same invisible highways, as if the entire world was on the move toward survival. Then came winter, the ultimate test. Snow buried the plains in a white silence, and food became scarce. The bison faced the bitter cold with thick, woolly coats that grew heavier each year, their fur trapping warmth against even the harshest winds. When the snow lay too deep, they used their massive heads as plows, swinging side to side, clearing paths to reach the frozen grasses beneath. But even these efforts were not always enough. Many calves and older members of the herd succumbed to starvation, frostbite, or predators emboldened by hunger. The wolves and saber-toothed cats grew bolder in the long nights, circling the herds, waiting for weakness. And yet, despite all this, the bison endured. Their sheer numbers, their adaptability, and their unity allowed them to outlast the darkness. For every life lost, new ones would be born when spring returned, and the cycle would begin again. This endless dance with the seasons was not just survival. It was a testament to resilience. The bison did not merely live in the Ice Age. They were architects of its plains, shaping the rhythm of life for everything that depended on them. They were the lifeblood of an ecosystem, a force of nature as mighty as the rivers and winds themselves. The life of the ancient bison was never truly at peace because while the herds roamed the great plains in numbers that could darken the horizon, their strength and abundance also drew the attention of predators that had evolved alongside them in this unforgiving Ice Age world, and none were more formidable than the saber-toothed cats whose fangs gleamed like ivory blades in the sunlight, the dire wolves that hunted with relentless teamwork, and even the short-faced bear whose massive bulk could scatter an entire herd with a single charge. Yet the bison were not defenseless, for their unity was their shield, and their sheer size made even the bravest hunter hesitate before attacking. So when danger approached, the cows gathered their calves in the center, while the bulls formed a wall of horns and muscle on the outside, stamping the ground and snorting clouds of breath into the cold air. And when a predator dared to test them, the herd moved as one, a tidal wave of pounding hooves that could trample any challenger. Still, the predators persisted because the Ice Age offered few easy meals, and the weakest members of the herd were always at risk: the sick, the old, or the very young who could not keep pace. And in those moments, nature revealed its cruel balance, where survival of one species depended on the sacrifice of another. Yet through this constant struggle the bison endured. For every loss was repaid in the birth of new calves each spring, and with each season the herds adapted, their coats thicker, their instincts sharper, their migration paths etched deeper into memory. And so the eternal struggle between predator and prey became not just a story of death, but of persistence, a living dance that shaped the destiny of both hunter and hunted. And it was this resilience, this ability to withstand the ceaseless trials of the Ice Age, that made the ancient bison more than just animals of the plains. They became symbols of survival itself, woven into the very identity of the land they roamed, as constant and enduring as the endless winds that swept across their frozen world. As the years turned and the Ice Age seasons shifted in their endless cycle, the ancient bison learned to live not only by strength but by rhythm, following the pulse of the earth itself. For spring brought with it the thawing of rivers and the slow return of green grass across the plains, a time when calves were born and herds swelled with new life, their small bodies shaky at first, but soon strong enough to run at the side of their mothers. Summer followed with its long days of warmth and abundance when the herds grew fat on tall grasses and the bulls clashed in violent contests of strength, locking horns and thundering collisions that echoed across the land. Each battle not merely a fight for dominance, but for the right to lead, to protect, to shape the future of the herd. And then came autumn when the air turned sharp and the days grew shorter. The grasses began to wither and herds gathered closer together, sensing the approach of hardship. For winter was the great test, season that would decide which lives endured and which were claimed by the cold. The snows fell thick and deep, covering the ground in a white prison that made grazing scarce, and every mouthful of frozen grass a desperate effort. The calves born in spring now stood taller, but still fragile against the biting winds. And it was during these winters that predators thrived, for hunger made even the strongest bison stumble, and the weak could no longer keep pace with the herd. Yet even in the heart of winter, there was a lesson of endurance, for the bison's thick woolly coats grew heavy with frost, yet shielded them for the worst of the cold. Their bodies stored the strength of the summer grasses, and their spirit, bound in unity, carried them forward. And when spring finally returned, thawing the ice and painting the land with green once more, the herds emerged leaner, scarred, but alive, proof of their resilience. And so each year was not merely a cycle of survival, but a forging of their legacy, a shaping of their strength through repetition. For every calf that survived its first winter was another step in the story of the bison's endurance. And each passing season tied the herd closer to the land, until they became not just inhabitants of the plains, but embodiments of it, moving with the rhythm of earth, sky, and time itself. The ancient bison, massive and unyielding, were not only tested by the forces of nature, but also by the arrival of a new predator unlike any they had faced before. For while saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and short-faced bears had always been part of the great struggle of survival, there came another hunter who did not fight with fangs or claws, but with fire, strategy, and tools born of thought. This hunter was man, and his presence reshaped the destiny of the plains forever. At first, the hunters were few, nomadic bands who followed the herds across vast distances, learning their movements and their rhythms. They watched with patience, they studied with sharp eyes, and when the moment was right, they struck with weapons carved from stone and bone, spears tipped with flint and thrust with deadly precision. For a single successful hunt meant food, warmth, and survival for an entire clan. And so the bison, once threatened only by nature's beasts, now found themselves stalked by a creature who hunted not for instinct but for vision, who looked at the herd and saw more than just prey, who saw clothing, tools, weapons, and even the bones that could shape shelters. The relationship between man and bison was a balance both brutal and sacred, for the hunters depended on the herds for survival, just as the herds were shaped by the pressure of predation, and yet the hunters did not seek to destroy them entirely, for they knew that the death of the herd would mean the death of themselves. But over generations, as their numbers grew, the hunts grew larger, the traps more complex, and the bison began to feel the weight of a new danger, one that did not vanish with the retreat of winter or the migration of predators, one that lived in the persistence of humankind. And so a new chapter of survival unfolded, where the bison stood not only against the beasts of the Ice Age, but against the clever hands and hungry hearts of those who walked on two legs. Every year, as the seasons turned, the herds of ancient bison moved in vast migrations across the frozen plains, rivers, and valleys, their hooves pounding the earth until it trembled beneath their weight, a sea of dark, shaggy bodies stretching further than the eye could see, guided by instinct as old as time itself. They moved where the grass grew richest and the rivers flowed strongest, for their survival depended on movement. To stay in one place was to risk starvation, predators, or the harsh bite of the elements. And so their migrations became a dance of life and endurance that painted trails across entire continents. Calves born in spring grew strong during the long summer marches. Mothers guided their young through rivers swollen with meltwater. Bulls roared and clashed at the edges of the herd as they tested their dominance even while on the move, and predators followed, always watching, waiting for the weak or the straggler to falter. The migration was not without loss. For every river crossing claimed lives, every snowstorm buried some beneath its weight, every predator claimed its share, yet the herd endured, for their strength was in numbers, in unity, in the endless rhythm of hooves and breath and willpower. And as they carved their migrations across the land, they became not just creatures of survival, but sculptors of the landscape itself, shaping trails, spreading seeds, and feeding the balance of the great Ice Age ecosystem. Their migrations were the heartbeat of the plains, and as long as they thundered across the earth, life itself seemed to move with them. But even the mightiest herds could not move unchallenged, for predators lurked at every turn, shadowing their steps with hunger and cunning. Dire wolves, massive and relentless, hunted in coordinated packs, their yellow eyes glinting with intelligence as they singled out the young and the weak. Saber-toothed cats, with their curved daggers of bone, lay in ambush, striking with sudden fury, their power capable of bringing down even a strong adult, and a short-faced bear, towering over any predator of its age, roamed the plains with a strength unmatched, able to drive entire packs away from their kills with its sheer bulk. The bison knew these predators well, for they had lived alongside them for millennia, and every confrontation was a test of courage unity, and endurance. The herd's defense lay in its numbers, for when predators struck, the herd closed ranks. Calves were pushed to the center, bulls formed a wall of horns, and the thunder of hooves became both shield and weapon. Many predators fell beneath the weight of trampling feet or the slash of sharp horns. But just as often, the herd lost one of its own, for predators were patient, relentless, and hungry. Their survival depended as much on the herd as the herd's survival depended on resisting them. And so, the relationship between bison and predator was both brutal and essential, for without the chase, without the constant testing of the herd's strength, the bison would never have become the giants of endurance. They were every scar upon their hides, every calf carried to safety, every clash between horns and fangs was part of a larger story, a story that bound prey and predator together in the eternal cycle of Ice Age survival. The winters of the Ice Age were merciless, a test that pressed against the very limits of endurance. The winds swept across the plains like living blades, carrying snow that buried the grasslands and choked the rivers beneath ice. For months the world seemed frozen in silence, a silence broken only by the howls of wolves or the muffled steps of herds forcing their way through snowdrifts. For the bison, winter was the season of trials. The fat gained and summer dwindled. Every step became a battle against exhaustion, and every day without food weakened the herd further. Calves, still not fully grown, shivered against the cold, their mothers pressing close to shield them with their warmth. Yet many did not survive, their small bodies claimed by the frost. Predators thrived in these months, for hunger weakened the herd and made them easier prey. Wolves followed closely, cats watched from the shadows, even men grew bolder in winter, driving herds into icy traps where survival was almost impossible. But the bison endured. Their shaggy coats grew thick with wool that resisted the wind. Their bodies drew upon hidden reserves of strength, and their unity carried them through. And when at last the first signs of spring appeared, when the snow began to melt and the first green shoots broke through the thawing earth, the survivors emerged scarred but alive, proof once again that their spirit could withstand even the coldest wrath of nature. And in their survival, they carried forward not just their lives, but the story of an unbroken lineage, a promise to the future that the herd would continue. As centuries passed and the Ice Age drew slowly toward its end, change swept across the land. The great glaciers that had shaped the world for thousands of years began to retreat. Melting rivers cut through the earth, carving valleys and flooding plains. The climate grew warmer, the seasons shifted, and with them, the balance of life itself began to transform. For the bison, this meant new challenges and new opportunities. Grasses spread wider and richer than before, opening new pastures and feeding even larger herds. But with this abundance came greater dangers. Predators, once confined to certain territories, followed the herds more freely, and the human hunters, growing in skill and number, developed new tools, new strategies, and an unyielding hunger that threatened to tip the balance. The Ice Age world was fading, and a new world was being born, a world in which survival would not be decided solely by the cold, but by the growing dominance of humankind. Yet the bison, resilient and unbroken, stood at the center of this change. Their migrations still thundered across the earth, their herds still shaped the land, and their survival through the turning of ages became a symbol of endurance itself. For even as the old world died and a new one began, the spirit of the ancient bison refused to fade, carrying forward into history as one of the last great giants of the Ice Age. As the glaciers melted further, the Ice Age world began to lose many of its towering beasts. Mammoths and mastodons dwindled, saber-toothed cats vanished, and even the dire wolves grew fewer with each passing century. Yet the ancient bison endured, their strength rooted not in size alone, but in adaptability. Where others faltered, the bison shifted, moving with the changing grasses, adjusting to warmer plains, and standing as a bridge between the world that was ending and the world that was being born. Their herds were no less mighty, their migrations no less thunderous, but the silence that grew across the plains was undeniable, for the roars of predators and the trumpets of mammoths grew faint, and the bison became among the last echoes of the Ice Age giants, still holding on while others fell into memory. And in their endurance lay the quiet truth of survival, that to persist is often the greatest strength of all. But as the animals of the old world disappeared, another presence grew ever stronger. The humans who once trailed the herds in small numbers now spread across continents, their weapons sharper, their traps more deadly, and their minds sharper than any predator before them. They had fire, they had cooperation, and they had vision, for they did not see only the hunt of today, but the survival of tomorrow. Entire communities depended on the bison, their meat dried into stores for the lean months, their hides stretched into clothing and shelter, their bones turned into tools, and their sinew into thread. Nothing of the bison was wasted, and so the herds, once pursued by claws and fangs, now found themselves shaped by human survival. But fire was more than just warmth and light. It was a weapon. Hunters burned patches of grassland to drive the herds, to control their movements, to make the land itself a tool for the hunt. The plains glowed red with flames as men and women reshaped the earth in ways no animal had ever done. And the bison, for all their strength, could not fight fire. They could only run, and so fire became the silent shadow of humanity, spreading across the horizon, reshaping the destiny of the herds. The Ice Age had been a world of cold and beasts, but the New Age was a world of people and change, and for the bison the storm gathered slowly. First in the growth of human settlements, then in the expansion of their hunting grounds, and finally in the spread of weapons beyond stone and bone. For as the centuries turned and civilizations rose, spears gave way to arrows, arrows to metal, and eventually, the clash of entire cultures fell upon the herds. The bison did not know of progress, of invention, of empire, yet they bore the weight of it all, hunted not only for survival, but for trade, for wealth, for conquest. And still their herds thundered across the plains, still they resisted, but the storm that gathered was greater than any predator, greater than any winter. It was the storm of a world remade by the will of humankind, and in that storm the fate of the bison, like so many giants before them, trembled on the edge of survival. Yet even as the dangers grew, the spirit of the bison remained unbroken, for they were creatures bound not just by instinct, but by the deep unity of the herd. When one fell, the herd closed ranks. When calves cried, mothers stood unyielding. When storms raged, they pressed shoulder to shoulder and endured. This spirit carried them through centuries of change, through winters and summers, through hunts and migrations. And in this spirit, they became more than beasts of survival. They became symbols, for to the people of the plains the bison were sacred, a living connection to the earth itself. Their migrations were not just movement, but ceremony. Their survival not just chance, but destiny. And so long as the herds thundered across the land, the spirit of endurance lived with them, unyielding, eternal, and vast as the plains themselves. As the Ice Age faded into memory, the earth reshaped itself in silence. The great glaciers that once carved valleys and spread sheets of ice across continents had retreated, leaving behind vast open plains, wide rivers, and endless seas of grass. These were not the lands of endless cold and hunger anymore, but instead a place of renewal. On these plains, the ancient bison became the architects of balance. Wherever they moved, grass followed, for their hooves broke the soil, their waste fed the land, and their grazing kept the prairies alive. They were not simply survivors of the Ice Age. They had become shapers of the New World. Each thunderous migration carried more than just life for the herd. It carried fertility for the soil, strength for predators that trailed behind, and sustenance for humans who had come to depend on their presence. Yet, with this transformation of the land came new challenges, for the wide open plains also meant less shelter, less cover, and greater exposure to the eyes of hunters who now spread further than ever before. Still, the bison endured, their herds vast enough to fill the horizon, their backs gleaming beneath the sun like a dark sea in motion. The humans who once followed the bison out of necessity grew into masters of the hunt. They were no longer just small groups scattered across the land, but entire communities woven around the migrations of the herds. With sharpened stone points, bows that bent with the strength of sinew and the patience of generations, they crafted ways to hunt the largest animals with precision. Some drove bison into natural traps, canyons, or steep ravines where escape was impossible. Others used fire to guide their paths, pushing them into kill zones where arrows rained down. The bison stood strong as individuals, but as a herd, they were vulnerable to human intelligence, for humans hunted not with strength alone, but with strategy, vision, and unity. Still, there was a deep respect, for these people did not kill for sport. They killed for life itself. To take the life of a bison was to feed an entire village, to clothe children through the winter, to build tools from bone and shelter from hide. The bison and the people became locked in a relationship both sacred and perilous, bound together by survival, yet always teetering on the edge of overuse. The hunters of this new age learned to live with the herds, and in return, the herds became the lifeblood of their world. Though humans became the dominant force, the plains still echoed with the presence of predators from an older time. Packs of wolves hunted the weaker calves at the edges of herds, stalking with patience before striking with fury. The memory of saber-toothed cats still lingered in stories, though they had long vanished into extinction, leaving behind smaller, yet no less cunning hunters. Mountain lions prowled rocky ridges, their golden eyes fixed on stragglers. Bears, especially the massive short-faced bear before its final decline, claimed bison when the chance arose, relying on sheer size and intimidation. Each predator tested the herds, keeping them wary, strengthening their bonds, and reminding them that the world was never free of danger. Yet the bison survived not by defeating every predator, but by holding together. A predator might claim the weak, the old, or the isolated, but never the heart of the herd. Their numbers, their unity, and their endless movement made them stronger than any single hunter. Even humans, with all their intelligence, could only take what the herd allowed through its vastness. In this balance, life continued, predator and prey woven into the fabric of survival across the shifting plains. No matter how vast their numbers, no matter how strong their unity, the bison were always at the mercy of the seasons. Summer brought sweltering heat across the open plains, the grasses dried and brittle, waterholes shrinking under the burning sun. In these times, the herds moved further, searching for rivers, guided by memory and instinct passed down through generations. Calves weakened, mothers pressed on, and still the herd moved as one, never stopping for long, for to stop was to die. Winter, however, was the true test. The wind returned with icy claws, and snow buried the land in silence. The bison's thick coats, grown dense and woolly, shielded them from the bitter cold, but hunger gnawed at them when the grasses lay hidden beneath snow and ice. Their massive heads swung low, plowing through drifts, scraping the earth with horn and muzzle to uncover what little nourishment remained. Calves huddled close to their mothers, their survival balanced on warmth and protection. Many did not endure the coldest nights. Yet every spring brought renewal. The snow melted, the rivers swelled, and the grasses returned in waves of green. For every calf lost, new life was born, and the herd surged once more, proving that hardship was not defeat, but a cycle woven into the destiny of the plains. The bison were not creatures of stillness. To remain in one place was to wither, for the land could not sustain their vast numbers without movement. Migration was their law, their rhythm, their unshakable truth. When the spring grasses rose in soft green waves, the herds surged forward, moving like rivers of muscle and horn across the open plains. Tens of thousands lifted the earth with their hooves, their thunder echoing for miles, a sound that could be felt in the bones of the land itself. Calves learned to walk within hours of birth, their legs trembling but guided by instinct, for they had no time to waste. The herds pressed north in summer, chasing cool breezes and rich grazing grounds, then turned south in winter when snow threatened to bury their sustenance. This cycle had no end. It was written in their blood, carried in the songs of the winds, etched into the very soil they crossed. The people who lived among them, the predators who stalked them, even the grasses themselves, all were bound to this ceaseless journey. Migration was not simply survival. It was life itself, a dance between earth and sky, a promise that the herds would always return as long as the world allowed. To witness the full might of a migrating herd was to see the earth transformed. Dust rose like storm clouds, the horizon blurred by the endless tide of moving bodies. Their hooves struck like drums, creating a rhythm older than time, a heartbeat of the plains. Predators paused in silence when the herds passed, overwhelmed by their sheer scale. Humans stood in awe, knowing that each animal was food, shelter, and tool, yet also recognizing something sacred in their presence. Around campfires, stories grew. Elders told of a time when the herds were so vast they blocked the sun, when their migrations stretched beyond sight, when the bison themselves were seen as a gift from the sky. The bison became more than flesh and bone. They became legend, spirits of endurance, teachers of unity. Even those who hunted them prayed before the kill, offering thanks, for to harm the herd without respect was to offend the balance of the world. Over generations, this reverence intertwined with survival, and the bison entered the myths of every people who shared the plains. They were no longer just animals. They were thunder made flesh, the guardians of grass and soil, the eternal walkers of the open land. But even legends face change. As centuries passed, humans grew in number and in skill. Villages became settlements, and settlements turned into sprawling communities that stretched across the very plains the bison had ruled. Hunters became warriors, and, soon, hunting was not always about survival. It was about dominance. Metal replaced stone, arrows flew faster, and weapons grew sharper. Horses, once wild, became allies of men, giving hunters speed that matched the bison's endurance. Entire herds could now be driven with precision that had once been unthinkable. The balance that had endured since the Ice Age began to tilt. Though the bison remained strong, their vast migrations were slowly broken by fences, by fire, by men who no longer prayed over their kills. The thunder of hooves still echoed, but shadows crept across the horizon. What had once been endless freedom began to feel the weight of an unseen end. The herds pressed forward as always, blind to the future, carrying with them the memory of ice and snow, yet the land itself was shifting under their hooves. A new era was dawning, and it was not one shaped by nature alone, it was shaped by man. The ancient bison had endured glaciers, predators, and storms, but the most formidable challenge was now upon them. Humans, no longer bound by the hunger of small tribes, hunted for trade, for wealth, for conquest. The arrival of iron-tipped spears and firearms shattered the old order of balance. Herds that once numbered in the tens of thousands were chased relentlessly. Entire migrations disrupted not for food, but for skins and trophies. The great predators of the plains, wolves, lions, bears, faded one by one, outcompete by humans who hunted not to survive but to control. The bison, once the masters of the grasslands, found themselves pressed into shrinking spaces, their paths cut off by settlements, their rivers guarded, their grazing grounds claimed. And yet, even in this struggle, their spirit remained unbroken. When pressed, the herds fought back, bulls standing tall with horns lowered, protecting calves with a fury that even horses feared. Though they fell in great numbers, each battle carried the same truth that had defined them since the Ice Age. The bison would never surrender quietly. Their thunder might dim, but as long as one herd remained, the legacy of their survival endured. The world of the bison, once boundless, began to unravel. Where there had once been endless horizons of grass, fences appeared, sharp wooden barriers that cut across the ancient migration routes. Rivers that had flowed freely were dammed or redirected, and the fertile plains were carved into farmland by settlers who saw the earth not as a shared gift, but as property to be divided. The bison, creatures of movement, could not understand this confinement. Herds found themselves trapped, unable to reach winter grazing lands, dying by the thousands when snow buried the remaining grass. Worse still were the hunters who came not for food, but for profit. They rode on horseback with rifles, firing into herds until the ground was carpeted with the fallen. Entire groups were slaughtered in a single afternoon, their hides stripped, their bodies left to rot beneath the sun. The plains, once alive with thunder and dust, grew quiet, broken only by the howling of scavengers. In less than a century, numbers that had stretched into the tens of millions dwindled to mere thousands. It was a collapse as swift as it was brutal, not wrought by ice or fire, but by human hands. And yet, even as their world crumbled, a small ember of survival burned within the bison, a stubborn refusal to vanish entirely. Those who looked closely at the surviving herds could see the shadows of an older world still alive within them. Their massive shoulders and curved horns were echoes of the beasts that had once faced saber-toothed cats and dire wolves. Their migrations, though broken, still traced the ghostly paths carved during the Ice Age, when glaciers retreated and grasslands spread across the continent. Each calf that stumbled after its mother carried within it the memory of a time when mammoths walked beside them, when humans were still learning fire, when the earth was a colder, harsher place. The bison were more than animals. They were time travelers, fragments of an ancient age persisting against impossible odds. Scientists who studied their bones marveled at how little they had changed, how perfectly adapted they remained to a world that no longer existed. To see a bison on the plains was to glimpse the Ice Age made flesh, to feel the presence of an unbroken chain stretching back over 2 million years. Though their herds had been shattered, their very existence was a defiance of extinction. In their dark, steady eyes was a message written across time. The past was not gone. It walked still, heavy-hooved and silent upon the living earth. For as long as the bison endured, the land endured with them. They were more than wanderers. They were engineers of the plains. Their hooves churned the soil, breaking open spaces for seeds to take root. Their grazing kept the grasses in balance, preventing any one species from overrunning the rest. They carved trails that became rivers of life, paths followed by deer, elk, and even humans. Where they wallowed, dust and mud became ponds that nourished insects and birds. The entire ecosystem, vast and fragile, leaned upon their weight. Without the bison, the plains began to falter. Grasses grew too tall and brittle, wildfires spread unchecked, and predators lost their prey. The collapse of the herds was not merely the loss of an animal. It was the unraveling of a web that had taken millennia to weave. Yet in the scattered survivors, the guardianship remained. Even a single herd, moving together, could restore the rhythm of the land. The bison were not only survivors of the Ice Age. They were keepers of balance, the silent caretakers of the grass that fed the earth itself. In them, the memory of harmony between land and life still endured, waiting to awaken once more. Just when it seemed the bison would vanish forever, voices rose in their defense. Some came from indigenous nations who had always revered the herds, who remembered the old prayers, the old balance, and who fought to protect what remained. Others came from settlers and scientists who, moved by the sight of near extinction, sought to preserve at least a remnant of the great herds. Small sanctuaries were established, hidden corners of the plains where the bison could still roam without the crack of rifles. Calves were raised in protected valleys, bulls guarded with vigilance, herds bred slowly back into strength. It was not the endless thunder of old, but it was survival. From the brink of oblivion, the bison began to rise again, stubborn as the earth itself. Though their numbers were a fraction of what they had once been, their presence carried a weight far greater than flesh. To see them was to remember a world before fences, before cities, before the roar of engines drowned the sound of hooves. Their revival was not just the survival of a species, it was a reminder of resilience, of the power of life to endure against all odds. The whispers of revival spread across the land, carrying with them the promise that the thunder of the plains would not be silenced forever. The wild herds of ancient bison were nearly silenced, yet even in their diminished state, they carried within them the memory of what once was. Those who saw the last remnants on the plains often spoke of the strange power they felt in the presence of these beasts. A herd of only a few hundred could still transform the horizon with its movement, still send vibrations through the ground when it broke into a run, still fill the wind with the smell of earth and musk. Though small in number, their spirit was not diminished, and in that spirit there was defiance. They were the last echoes of thunder, survivors of an age that seemed too vast and wild to have ever existed. The people who sought to protect them understood this. They realized that the bison represented more than survival. They were living proof that not everything from the Ice Age had been lost. Each animal carried the DNA of countless ancestors who had faced wolves, lions, and saber-tooths. Each step was a bridge connecting the present world to the deep time of glaciers and mammoths. And so, even in small refuges, the herds became symbols of wildness itself. The echoes of thunder had not gone silent. They had only grown softer, waiting for the chance to rise again. Over time, efforts to restore the bison grew bolder. Protected lands were expanded, and herds were reintroduced to places where they had been absent for generations. The return of the bison was more than ecological. It was spiritual, cultural, and deeply human. On the reservations of native nations, the bison's revival was a restoration of identity. For centuries, the animal had been at the center of their way of life, woven into ceremonies, stories, and survival. To see the herds return was to heal wounds that stretched back through generations of loss. On the plains themselves, their return was a healing of the land. Grasses flourished where their hooves churned the soil. Birds nested in the wallows they left behind. Predators found new strength in following their movements. It was as if the land itself had been waiting for their return, holding its breath until the bison once more walked its surface. Scientists, ranchers, and indigenous leaders worked together to give them space, to give them freedom, to give them a chance to live as they once had. Slowly, the thunder began to build again, not in millions, but in thousands, enough to remind the earth of its ancient rhythm. The grasslands, scarred by centuries of exploitation, began to breathe again. As the herds grew and spread, the bison came to symbolize endurance itself. In the United States, they were named the national mammal, standing alongside the bald eagle as a symbol of strength and freedom. But unlike the eagle, whose wings carried it across the sky, the bison embodied the grounded, unshakable resilience of the land. Their massive forms, dark eyes, and silent patience spoke to something deeper: the ability to survive upheaval, to endure collapse, to rise from near extinction. To children visiting protected parks, they were living history lessons, proof that the Ice Age was not a story locked in books, but a presence that still walked among them. To scientists, they were windows into evolution, reminders of how creatures could persist across millions of years of change. To indigenous peoples, they were family, sacred beings who had never ceased to offer gifts, even when hunted to the brink. To everyone who looked upon them, they were a reminder that life is fragile, yet also stubborn and unyielding. The bison stood as proof that survival was possible even when all seemed lost, that the story of the Ice Age was not over. It lived on in their heavy hoofbeats, in the dust they raised, in the low, rumbling calls that echoed across the plains. Though their numbers may never again reach the countless millions that once darkened the horizon, the bison have reclaimed their place in the world. Today, herds roam in national parks, on reservations, and across private lands where conservationists have worked tirelessly to protect them. They are not confined to history, nor are they ghosts. They are alive, breathing, enduring. To stand before them is to feel the weight of deep time, to sense the continuity of life across ages. They are not just animals. They are living bridges to an Earth that existed long before human cities, long before empires, long before the world we know. And in this, they are eternal. For as long as a bison lowers its head to graze, as long as its hooves strike the earth, as long as its herd moves together in unity, the spirit of the Ice Age endures. The eternal herds do not march in silence. They thunder. They thunder not just for themselves, but for the land, for the ancestors, for the future. They are proof that the wild is never truly gone, only waiting, patient, for the moment when it can rise again. The story of the ancient bison is not finished. It continues, carried forward in the living bodies of every calf born under the open sky. The thunder of the plains will never be silenced, for it lives on in them, eternal and unbroken.